While I do love the idea of retro throwback games a ton, they are usually quite hit or miss, most of the time borrowing too much of the bad and not enough of the good from the game they are trying to lovingly imitate. But I think the question on all of your minds is, does Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon have those very same problems, or is it able to stand on its own, regardless of its throwback status? Well, let's find out. Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon is an action platformer game that borrows heavily from Castlevania and a fair bit of Ninja Gaiden actually. The story is a bit bare bones, but the story is as follows. You play as a cursed warrior by the name of Zangetsu. After being afflicted with the moon's curse by a horde of demons, you brandish your sword and vow to slaughter every sinister and vile creature in the lands, gut style. As for the rest of the story, outside some closing text when you beat the normal mode, and of course plenty of visual storytelling from the map and environments, you'll have to piece together what exactly is going on past the obvious demon extermination for yourself. Well, every time you meet a new character, there is dialogue. It's short and basically the same thing every time. A pure-hearted, yet similarly infected individual pleads Zangetsu to spare them, and he allows this on the condition that they aid him in his fight against evil. Speaking of the characters, every one of the cast of heroes is varied and interesting. You have the main protagonist Zangetsu, the main badass who is donned in a red cloak-like samurai jacket, and a very Punish-style getup with his robotic metal hand and his eye patch. The rest of our heroes are the main protagonist of the sequel of sorts by the name of Miriam, a gorgeous shardbender who wields a whip Belmont style and Dio-like daggers, a warlock-like wizard by the name of Alfred who aids the group with varying spells, and a mysterious vampire-like character by the name of Gebel who can summon bats at will and also turn into one. This is an 8-bit NES era throwback game, so don't expect much more characterization outside of that, but I do like the spin on the fantasy genre cast here on offer. The Rogues Gallery were more style and spectacle than they were actual characters in the story itself, but I guess mostly mindless evil wouldn't stop for a chat with our heroes. The game is like a more refined classic Castlevania game, but there are definitely some quality of life improvements over the obvious inspiration. But first, yes, you move from stage to stage, platforming and slashing and whipping away at a vast array of sprited baddies. Each character plays quite differently from one another, and this gives the gameplay some decent depth and strategy for how to play around with all of it. First comes the normal mode, where you start with only Zangetsu, slowly adding each character to your group as you journey to your final goal. After each level boss, you'll meet a new character and can swap to them on the fly after unlocking them. Zangetsu has his quick sword strikes, Miriam has her long-range whip and higher jump, Alfred is incredibly weak and short-ranged in terms of melee combat, but has support spells that can be a real aid sometimes, and Gebel is easily my favorite character to play because even though he doesn't have any secondary weapons to pick up, he can shoot a spread of short-range bats and turn into a bat and fly around himself to find secrets. Each of the characters has a distinct use, but the game doesn't box you as the player into solely using them for a single thing. You are given some nice freedom to play around with each of the weapons and powers, and what's even better is that not only can you scroll both left and right on the map, but you can also take alternative paths after unlocking characters or playing through the secondary campaign called Nightmare Mode. Combat for the most part is really satisfying, with some decent challenge thrown in. Enemies mostly go down in 1 or 2 hits, and when they die, they either explode or gush into pixelated blood. I was happy that the game didn't shy away from showing enemies go down into a burst of gibs if they were fleshier. There was a good deal of sub-weapons between each of the characters, with Zangetsu having warping energy cards, long-reaching metal chains, Miriam had her knives and bladed weapons, Alfred had different spells, and Gebel had the ability to turn any item that wasn't health into sub-weapon points, which was very useful. Also, speaking of how you get sub-weapons, the lanterns sitting around are differently colored depending on both character and what they might have inside them, which I thought was a nice touch-up because it allowed you to strategize which character would get the weapon that was inside, as if you're a certain character, you would have to be that character to use their power-up, as characters couldn't use character-specific sub-weapons. Enemies were decently varied, and even though some were just area-proper redesigns of other previous enemies, I didn't mind as they would be placed in either a new area or have a slightly different strategy for taking them down. So there was strategy, even though some of them were technically just reskins. What's really cool about having 4 characters is that you can swap between them on the fly, and each character has their own health bar, even if the sub-weapon points are shared between all of them. I do like that if I need one of the other characters when swapping, the game will pause for a brief second if you need to swap over more than one, or if you made a mistake so you can select the right character by going back. One problem with the character swapping, however, is that you can't just resume where you die with another character. No, usually you are either spawned right outside of the area or a room away from where you just died. This isn't so bad early on, but becomes a bit tedious tedious when having to fight through several rooms later in the game. Also, the death system here was thankfully very forgiving. If you lost the character, like I previously stated, you will spawn just a little bit away from where you died. Something that was usually fixed by having health nearby, but not always, was the fact that characters didn't spawn with fresh health until a full group life was lost. No, if you died at a boss with one character and were on your last legs with the others, that remaining health was the health that you were granted, which sometimes made the game a lot more challenging than it had any right to be. If you lose all of your party members, you are sent back to the most recent major room, and if you lose all your lives, you have to start the entire level over again. Thankfully, you have infinite continues in terms of going on from where you last got a game over, so it's not like you're sent all the way back to the beginning of the game. The game isn't cruel like a lot of its inspirations. Platforming here is slightly smoother than what you would actually experience on a real NES game. While there have been nice features added here, like the ability to quickly swap to Gebel if he's still alive and possibly turn into a bat if you fall, the problems really show themselves when trying to properly make safe jumps. However, that isn't to say the game isn't without some major problems like the older games. For one, damage knockback is still a thing here. If you get damage and just so happen to be close enough to a death pit, well, sorry, but you lose that character or get a game over. Another problem is just how stiff and imprecise some of the jumping really feels. In fact, sometimes if you don't arc your jump just correctly, you'll either lock in place or not make the jump at all. Sometimes when trying to make an arc jump, sometimes your jump would make you stand in place, or you would overshoot or undershoot your jump, which was really annoying. Another thing that I found annoying was that you had to make sure that you were pressing the move forward button when attacking and jumping, so that way you could actually jump and attack, because if you didn't, you would jump in place and attack. Just little things like that could become really frustrating when you're trying to take down a lot of enemies that were flying. If you try to attack certain ways, you can get locked. If you try to jump or slide or do other things, you can also sometimes lock up as well, and this can lead to some very frustrating deaths. It's not so bad on the normal mode, but on Nightmare, where there are heavier damaging enemies coming towards you, yeah, this is more noticeable. Boss battles were all really inspired and a lot of fun when they weren't overtly frustrating, as some of the later endgame bosses tended to get. Thankfully, when you figured out their pattern, you could master most of them with some patience, and beating them was oh so satisfying. Thankfully, outside of one recycled boss encounter, they were each unique, and while a few of them were not as amazing as the others, namely the pirate ship boss, there were some that were really darn cool, like the gold boss and some of the later bosses I do not want to spoil. An odd thing that every boss did was have a last-ditch attack that would always hit and drain your health, but never kill you, thankfully. It was surprising the first time, but I wasn't sure why it did this fake-out attack every single time after it. Each of the levels were very distinct and wonderfully unique. While some of them did creep into being familiar to any seasoned Castlevania fan, I would never say anything felt too similar or even downright the same as the other games like this. But when it wasn't borrowing familiar feels, it was downright inspired. While there were plenty of visual nods to other games, when the game was original in its map design, it was darn original. I loved the first level a ton, and some of the brightly colored hell maps on Nightmare mode were fun to look at, if not a bit bare, sadly. Each location was unique and felt different from one another, and I couldn't get enough of each of them. While the game is technically linear, with a single end goal to get to, there are varying pathways that you can take through each map. Some are easier and longer, some are harder and shorter, and if you pay attention, the remains of fellow adventurers can lead the proper correct way. There were plenty of hidden secrets and walls and passageways you would have to find on your own, and this offers up some healthy replay value for the 2 or 3 times you might give the game a play, as there are different modes and plenty of actual collectibles and level ups that you can add to your characters, like more health or more mana or stuff like that. Speaking of the different modes real quick, there are 2 different difficulty modes to play each of them on, Easy and Veteran. I assume Easy has enemies deal less damage or something similar, with more forgiving checkpoints, but I have only played the game on Veteran difficulty, which is basically the classic mode of the game that the game recommends you play on, but either one is totally acceptable. There are 3 different game modes to play. The story mode, which is called Normal Mode, where all 4 of the characters are here, and the beginning of the story takes place. Nightmare Mode, where you play as the 3 additional characters with some minor changes to make the game harder, along with a few new things added in, and a solo mode where you play as only Zangetsu, which plays out as a challenge mode. There are also apparently different endings depending on your actions in game, but I only found this out after googling the game after beating both of the story modes. I'll let you find out what these are for yourself, but having these included makes me question the canon status between this and Ritual of the Night, and these 2 games are even connected, as I have yet to fully play Ritual of the Night. I just know that characters and certain locations are reused in it. I will say though, once I found out that you could do certain things like this and tried it myself, I actually felt kind of bad. For a game that was supposed to emulate the look of an NES game, it looks darn nice, but it's clear that there are some graphical effects that are modern, being something the NES could never hope to pull off. Honestly, everything looked incredibly clean and high quality. There are plenty of different monster designs and sizes, all the bosses looked absolutely fantastic, creepy, and ever more sinister as the story went on, and the game was chock full of color. Each of the character sprites also had lots of attention to detail, well, as much as they could, and all of them had nice personality to them. The environments, like I said earlier, are all incredibly varied, and some of them are even downright atmospheric. Things like the train passing through the trees in the beginning and other such set pieces were just really cool to look at. The sound was also as good as you would want a game like this to sound like. Each area had a separate and catchy tune playing, none of the sounds ever grated on me, and the sound library thankfully wasn't limited to a cartridge worth of sound, having a wide variety of different ghoulish sounds from monsters and crunchy 8-bit goodness. All in all, outside of those minor stumbles that probably should have been left in the past, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon is a fantastic Castlevania-inspired throwback. It's just challenging enough to leave you wanting to see the bosses defeated, but not frustrating enough to make you angry at the game or even want to quit it. They are thankfully never enough to deter you from actually wanting to play the game. If you don't like retro games of this nature, or games on the harder side, or Castlevania games just aren't your thing, then it's best if you skip over this one. But for Castlevania fans and veterans looking for a new yet similar experience, or anyone else looking for a darn solid modern day retro classic, this is definitely one to give a try. As always, if you want to help support the channel, please consider sharing the video with a friend or checking out my Patreon linked in the description below. If you have any comments, questions, or recommendations, leave them down below as I read and reply to everything. Until next time, this is Thierry Williamson signing off until the next video. See ya, guys!